Hear me well? Yes. Thank you. My name is Lee Kang-Ki. I'm in Europe, and the weather conditions in Europe is not so good. The temperature gap, the day and night, is like 20 to 30. So temperature is going up and down, which is causing a lot of issues of the thought to many people. And as you know, the climate change is, I think, what we are experiencing every day. Wherever you go, I think the people talk about how serious the climate change is. We can just feel it every day. And also climate change has started to really negatively affect on all of us, making all of us to take action on this. So I would like to first share with you my presentation deck and continue. So hope you can see my presentation deck. Chairperson, can you see my presentation deck? Yes, we all can. So I think already the chairperson has introduced about my background, and I left Austria and I now moved to Germany. So please replace the information on your book with the new information about myself. So followed by Professor Lee, the speaker before me, I would like to talk to you about the goals set by the IMO, and also there are so many measures to abide by regulations set by the IMO. So I think Professor Lee well drew overall picture focusing on some fields, and there are many challenges caused by alternative fuels, and we have to wisely address those issues. And half of the GDP is generated by port industry. So I would like to specifically focus on the maritime fuels and their impact on port operation. So I serve myself as a person who take participation in decision making around regulations and also rules in the EU. So based on the experiences that I have been having, I would like to reflect my experiences on also the Korea's port industry. We are a relatively small country, and we are heavily dependent on shipbuilding industry. So the shipbuilding industry is a flagship industry of Korea. Korea is the nation of a flagship. Korea is the nation of a shipbuilding industry. So that means there are many advantages that we can enjoy. However, there are also downsides to it. And I would like to specifically tell you, focusing on port operation. Before I begin, I wish all of you the best of luck and also good health. And I would like to ask for your effort so that we can live free from climate change issues. we talk about how we can reduce carbon emissions and also greenhouse gases. So please join the collective efforts for reducing greenhouse gases. Till a few hours ago, EU decarbonization conference is what I have attended, and that's why I feel a bit uncomfortable with my throat. Sorry for that. Again, I would like to talk about the maritime fuels environment and how that has been changed. What's pleasant is that many people talk about not only carbon emissions but also to reduce greenhouse gases. I think that really makes me pleasant. Last year, many people talked about carbon-free, but I think entering into this year, more and more people talk about reduction of greenhouse gases. And I would like to just add on what's been addressed by the speaker before me. So, in the process of overcoming these issues, we need to know what the future holds, right? And what the scenario will be unfold. And I also would like to ask you that there is a huge gap in between the current status and the future that we want to embrace. And in order to reduce the gap, what issues are there and what lessons to be learned and how can we reflect that lessons onto our industry? Then I would like to turn your attention to the frontline industry, the port, which is like the boundary between the land and the ocean businesses. It's like a meeting point. And all the information that I have put into our slide deck is also actual data information utilized by the site. As you know, the amount of the fuels consumed by individual vessel is huge. So if you cannot get hold of the economic value, economic benefit, we cannot use the fuels, and also stability is very important. So for these two reasons, economic value and also stability, there are many issues to be addressed. And also the vessels need to be able to travel across the world. So availability is very important. And also when the British Empire declared that it is the nation of the sun, which is forever shining, back then the fuels for the vessels was like coal, solid fuel back then. And that's why the British Empire tried to have a place to supply the coals to the British vessels. So the coal was the main source of energy in the past until 1912. And in 1912, a huge change took place. In the late 19th century, a diesel engine was developed, and also back then, Denmark was a shipbuilding powerhouse. From the Teliba shipbuilding yard, the first fluid fuel, the liquid fuel, was developed, and it was something that was unprecedented back then, because there was only one place where you can you can supply liquid fuel. And there was a one single place, for example, oil station, which to supply the liquid fuel to the vessel. Back then, Prime Minister Churchill paid a visit to this place and talked about the impact of this liquid fuel. So the vessel which use liquid fuel, it had relatively small engine, but for just within 20 years of time, more than 90% of vessels started to use liquid fuel, not solid. The reason is simple. In terms of stability, it is advantageous. And also, liquid fuel is very convenient to use. So that improved working conditions. And also, we did not have to have a storage to store the coal. So in terms of the warehouse, we could use the space that we used to save the coal for storing liquid fuel. So till 2012, for about 100 years, from 1912, I don't know why, the coal was used for a century and liquid fuel was used for another century. And I think it was December 2012, for the first time in Korea, developed and also created and also procured by Korea. 2 projects were successfully completed. So the first vessel was put together in the shipyard in the US, but which was composed of the Korean equipment and parts, so it is not much to say that it was domestically produced. And also in a bigger shipbuilding yard, another vessel was put together, not 1, but 4, which brought about a huge change on the type of fuels that we use. And gaseous fuel, thanks to the environmental advantage. From 2012 to 2013, environmental regulation was much strengthened. So many people talked about we need to use the fuels better than the current fuels, so diesel. So normally HFO was used, and we thought that using LNG is much better in improving environment. So there are 4 conditions to be met to be used as a vessel fuel. So back then it was the very optimum fuel. But then environmental issues started to garner more attention, and we started to define the vessel fuel in a new way. Environment became the most important barometer. We had to think about whether the fuel emits CO2 or not, whether the fuel is carbon-free or not. So whether it is semi-free carbon or not. So we started to put a new definition onto the fuel. So this is ammonia-powered vessel. And the second vessel is the very first IGF vessel built by Korea, and also LNG fuel container vessel designed by the SEC. So we started to adopt new types of fuels. Of course, ammonia vessel, I think the size of the vessel will not be as large as this one because it is only staying at the conceptual stage. As I have mentioned, as well as by the Professor Lee, there are many substances which comes out of the combustion. So as I serve myself as the vice chairperson of the CIMAC here in Europe, the sentiment in the Europe is this. The policy and regulation is in line with carbon-free, but we are about to shift that to the reduction of greenhouse gases, and many work is on the way. Of course, when we opt carbon-free strategy, then meaning that we have to reduce the CO2. And I think you already know about SOx. And I would like to briefly mention about IPCC. According to the data by IPCC, right, carbon, particulate matter, in Korea we call it PM 2.5. There are 3 different definitions here. You can see the biggest problem is related to particulate matter. There is a global warming potential index by IPCC as a good example. For you to understand, I can give you this example in the process of combustion. If 1 gram of CO2 is emitted, then the equal amount of PM is generated as well. And this PM is different from region to region. And in terms of the impact, it wills bigger impact by 1,100 compared to CO2. So imagine generating the 1 PM, 1,700 global potential impact is there. So when vessel emits 1 gram of PM, then it is equivalent to the CO2, which is larger by 1,700 times. So reducing PM is very important. That's why the EU and also the USA are measuring the emission of the PM, especially emitted from vessels and other transportation like vehicles, because it has huge global warming potential. PM is garnering global attention, and as a carbon-free fuel, the ideal energy will be hydrogen. Because of the characteristics of the hydrogen, it is very, very hard to control the combustion of hydrogen. It combines with the nitrogen in the air, which produces NOx. And as the professor already said, the NOx stays in the air more than 280 days. So there are other adverse and also unexpected substances. And also every equipment and parts has a lubricant oil, which is very vulnerable to the reaction with the hydrogen. And as the carbon-free fuel, I will come back to this. Ammonia is one of the carbon-free fuels. It is very hard to combust ammonia. So meaning that other additional combustion parts or pilot oils are needed. In order to combust ammonia, there are additional impact, for example, ammonia leak in the process of meeting all the preconditions. So there are many problems around alternative fuels. So we have to come up with other types of alternative fuels as well as guidelines. So we are spending a lot of time to think about all this. And there is a black carbon, which is like a black smoke, which is a kind of PM, particulate matter. And we have to think about how we are going to define, how we are going to classify that black smoke. And also Also, there's underwater noise and also noise in the air, all of which are also defined as harmful substances. So on the top of the definition of the harmful substances, there are harmful impacts, which really gives us food for thought on how we're going to best regulate them. I think I better skip this slide because it is already well explained by the professor before me. And I would like to also talk to you about CIA. So Korea is the biggest country which builds ships, and also there are China and Japan, in which the shipbuilding industry is huge, and investment is mainly from European countries. And the best driver behind this industry is a CII. So ship owner is moving fast to place orders for more ships. If they do not abide by CII, that will cause huge issues in doing business. So CII is the biggest driver behind the trend at the moment. And the Korea is building high value-added ships. So I think IMO's regulation is a good news to a country like Korea. And from now on, I would like to talk to you about the gap. As is well explained by the professor, carbon-free strategy, GHG reduction strategy need to be different from one another. To easily put, there are two things I would like to mention. One is a life cycle assessment. Up until now, we do not really think over how the fuels is being produced. And once it is filling up the tank, we mainly thought about how much energy is created and how much harmful substances are created by the energy combustion according to the current regulation. So there was a concept started to appear which is called the dirty fuels. Hydrogen, ammonia, which are carbon-free fuels. And after introducing those fuels, we know that more industry is adopting it, but the amount of the coals consumed worldwide is not decreasing because of the regulation, the current regulations and also rules. So we have to think about how we can control life cycle of fuels. Only that way we can calculate and also manage and control harmful substances created throughout life cycle of fuels. So for a sustainable corridor, we have to think the fuels this way in a life cycle manner. But carbon-free strategy is all about how we are going to reduce the carbon emissions, meaning that the rest of the harmful substances or the rest of substances which create greenhouse gases, for example, hydrogen. Hydrogen is perfectly carbon-free fuel, but as it is combusted, more NOx is created and generated. So in this sense, definitely we have to control it throughout the life cycle. The same goes for ammonia as well. So I think focusing on CO2 is never enough. We have to think about greenhouse gases reduction in overall sense. So we have to set the rules and also regulations to control the total amount of harmful substances. For example, the parts which really create the emissions, engine and also tires, not only the combustion stage, but how it is produced and how it is supplied to tank. So I'm talking about we have to control well to wake in a life cycle manner. And from the very beginning of producing all the way to combusting the fuel. But then this would lead to many issues. I would like to just talk about one of it. We started to define the fuels in a new way. We've been using fossil fuels, so apart from that, as a new types of fuels, there are carbon-free fuels, hydrogen and ammonia. And as a carbon-neutral fuels, there are many more than you can see here, but a few of them include methane, alcohols, and paraffins. But there are 4 types: hydrogen, ammonia, methane, and methanol are major fuels supplied to the tank server vessels. So regulatory organization, also research institutes are paying attention to 4 different fuels.
Next slide. The recently published material was announced in April this year. One of the biggest vessel investor, and they also own the biggest number of ships. This is Maersk from Maersk on carbon neutrality. If we maintain the business as usual, if you see the prediction curve, will be like this, the one that I'm pointing at. But IMO requested states to achieve net zero by 2050, and the ideal scenario is the green line. The amount of the carbon-free fuels that we need is the orange line, and the gap is this big. We use the unit exajoule. If you convert exajoule, 1 exajoule is 24 million ton. It is huge in amount. So the fuel that we use is 12.6 exajoule. But we currently only have 1.2 exajoule of carbon-free fuel. So if we are to follow the plan of IMO, or the scenario of the IMO, I think it is practically impossible. We need to be more practical and represent the voices of the industry. And a lot of institutions are trying to establish more practical regulation. And they calculate the gap. So they suggested to publish a middle milestone. So this middle milestone approach is gaining a lot of positive feedback. I think that middle milestone suggestion is quite persuasive, and the countries will follow suit soon. From the perspective of operating the ship, if you look at the Baltic countries, They think methanol can be a good way to convert, just like we have converted from fossil fuel to LNG. So methanol is a better option than what we currently have. So we can offer another fuel source, but as mentioned, we need to think about the industry situation and be more practical. Considering the technical readiness level, the highest possible option was at the time methanol. That's why methanol was first introduced in the Baltic countries in their vessel, and also Korea has introduced it. We have built the first ever methanol ship here. And many ship owners and shipbuilding companies benchmark the methanol vessel into develop and get the orders from the shipping companies. But as mentioned, methanol is not the final answer and cannot be our final goal. It is just a transitional technology considering the practical situation of the industry. Again, this is not our final destination, and still we need to discover new fuel. But one of the constraints that we face is the situation of the industry. If you look at the vessel that was ordered by Maersk, and they decided not to order any more methanol vessel, and opted for LNG. So the trend is changing from methanol to LNG again. For the shipbuilding powerhouse, just like Korea, we'll have to pay attention to this trend. In short, this is the diagram that I've explained so far. So this is methanol and ammonia, hydrogen. Anyway, ammonia and hydrogen have many controversies, but those are the problems that we need to solve. And as those two sources are still positive in terms of going carbon-free, ammonia and hydrogen are carbon-free sources and can reduce the GHG emission. Especially ammonia, we have good infrastructure related to that. The production cost is quite low. Therefore, ammonia will be promising in the short term. So that's why the industry has high interest in ammonia. And another thing that's promising is if LNG is produced through renewable sources, then the LNG is powered not by fossil fuel, but from carbon-free sources. Then LNG will be considered as a carbon-free source again. In addition, if we can capture the carbon produced by burning the LNG or capture the carbon from LNG, then it can be considered as carbon-free. Again, if so, then LNG can be considered as midterm solution. That's why countries are preparing regulations and guidelines on LNG again. So this will be my conclusion part. I have explained a lot of energy sources. Let's see what impact they pose on port. And to achieve the sustainability of port operation, you will have to consider the influence of different new power sources or fuel sources. And I'll like to make some recommendations related to this. So carbon-free fuel or midterm solution for the carbon-free fuel such as LNG. We need to see the characteristics of those sources. First is that they are large in volume. If we are to store those fuels, then the tank will have to be really big. And in order to store it stably, then we need to liquefy. then the temperature will have to go down. To secure the temperature and the scale of the storage, then we need new technology again. For example, to store it in a low temperature, we need new technology to keep it at a really low degree Celsius. So these are the problems, new problems that we will face. So these are the new ideas recommended. So how we are going to store these new fuels. So these are the suggested concept. For hydrogen, we can compress it or store it in liquid or solid. And one thing is missing here. There's another option of net type storage suggested by KAIST and Norway scholars. I think that's a good way to store hydrogen. And those grid type storage can be applied not only to hydrogen but other sources of fuel as well. Ammonia, for ammonia, we have ISO tank. For methanol, we have synthetic LNG, and synthetic LNG, we have other types of tanks, low pressure tanks. There are different constraints to the storage method. If the tanks is getting bigger, then there are a lot of constraints. Storage and handling are the challenges. For example, we have to store it in a low temperature and liquefy the fuel. This is Busan Newport, a picture of the Busan Newport. So they are our technology. It is close to unmanned in operation. They have a lot of electrified equipment. Let's say there's a leak of this liquefied fuel kept at a lower temperature, cryogenic liquefied fuel. And there are 3 types of scrubbers. In case of dry scrubbers, the sulfur that is purified through dry scrubbers, they are big in amount, 2.5 pipe scrubbing, and that they contain sulfur. If that's we'll have to discharge this sulfur in certain part of this port. Let's say to a port area, apron area, then we need to solve a question on how we are going to automate. As you may have heard from the media, if we suffer from bad weather, if sulfur meets with water due to such weather condition, then SOx and other GHG sources will be created. And harmful substances can create another risk. And ammonia, as you well know, then the port authority will have to set up measures against these kind of scenarios. developed port countries, they have designated certain ports to prepare for the future type. They have set up different scenarios of using 10%, 20%, or 30% of new fuel and measures for each of that scenario. System and making a lot of efforts to commercialize those technology. Carbon is produced in a large amount. 6% of the vessel emission can be the source of carbon capture, but most of the amount should come from the atmosphere. When there's a pure CO2 and when that's discharged to the port, then that can create another problem. So Port Authority will have to think about this scenario as well. The current logistics system of the port is quite complicated, but other than that, handling the CO2 discharge or sulfur discharge is another scenarios that the port will have to be prepared. I think I'm running out of time, so this will be my last slide. Last week, this is the photo that I took on Thursday last week. This is Port of Marseille in France. There were 2 ships that berthed over there. And this is the LNG supply carrier vessel. So on the left side, you can see the port facility, even though the picture doesn't show it, but the port was really busy. Although this is just LNG vessel, but in the future it can be ammonia or methanol vessel. Let's imagine when those ammonia and methanol vessels come in to the discharge work, then ports will have to think about the situation if they berth. So this is the future scenario. When the vessels come, and the biggest number will be LNG vessels, and there will be ammonia, methanol, hydrogen, and biofuel vessels. Because for some countries or some vessel owner, biofuel can be their best option. And we already have several LNG vessels. And again, you can think of ethanol and methanol vessels. So these different types of fuel and vessels will exist. As previous professor mentioned before, we need to think about different scenarios that can be created from different type of vessel. So that's the homework that the Port Authority will have to solve. And according to that, ship owner and shipping companies will have to gather their wisdom. I think this poses the challenges and opportunities at the same time. A good opportunity for us because all of these challenges will create new industry. As the shipbuilding powerhouse, Korea faces a good opportunity in this field. Thank you for listening. This concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, please pass it to the moderator. Then I'll give you the answer. Again, thank you for listening. We saw a lot of climate issues this year, but I hope you health and happiness, and taking the opportunity, I hope you think about the oceans again. Thank you.
예,